The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield as Sarah Martinez adjusted her flight goggles for the third time. Around her, male pilots strutted with confidence, their leather jackets creaking as they discussed engine specifications and combat maneuvers. None of them looked her way. To them, she was just another curious woman who had somehow wandered into their exclusive world. Sarah had grown up watching planes soar overhead in her small Texas town, dreaming of the day she could join them in the clouds. Her father, a mechanic, at the local airstrip had taught her everything about engines before she could even reach the pedals of a car. By 16, she was rebuilding aircraft motors with her eyes closed. By 20, she had earned her pilot's license despite the raised eyebrows and whispered comments from instructors who questioned whether a woman belonged in the cockpit. The year was 1941, and America was on the edge of war. The military was desperately seeking pilots, but their recruitment posters featured strong-jawed men in uniform, not women with calloused hands and determined hearts. Sarah had applied to every aviation program she could find, only to receive polite rejection letters that praised her qualifications while suggesting she consider nursing or secretarial work instead. Dr. William Patterson, the chief medical officer at the airbase, had been particularly vocal about his concerns. During her physical examination, he had shaken his gray head disapprovingly. "Miss Martinez," he had said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "the human body experiences tremendous stress during high-speed flight. The G-forces alone can cause a person to lose consciousness. Women simply lack the physical constitution for such demands." His words stung, but they also fueled something fierce inside Sarah. She had spent countless hours studying aviation medicine, learning about the effects of acceleration on the human body. She knew that G-forces could indeed be dangerous, causing blood to pool away from the brain and leading to blackouts. But she also knew that proper training and conditioning could help pilots withstand these forces. What Dr. Patterson didn't know was that Sarah had been secretly training herself, using a makeshift centrifuge her father had helped her build in their barn. The other pilots at the base treated her like a novelty at best, a nuisance at worst. Captain James Wheeler, a decorated pilot with dozens of successful missions under his belt, had made his feelings clear during the morning briefing. "Flying isn't a game, sweetheart," he had said with a condescending smile. "When enemy fire starts, raining down and your plane is spinning out of control, you need someone with real strength and nerves of steel in that cockpit." Sarah bit her tongue, knowing that arguing would only reinforce their beliefs about emotional women. Instead, she focused on proving herself through actions. She arrived at the airfield before dawn each day, studying weather patterns and flight manuals while the men were still sleeping. She practiced emergency procedures until they became second nature, memorizing every gauge and control in the aircraft until she could operate them blindfolded. The training aircraft felt like coming home every time she climbed into the cockpit. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and leather, the responsive feel of the controls under her hands, the moment when the engine roared to life and the plane lifted off the ground. These sensations filled her with a joy that no amount of skepticism could diminish. In the air, she was free from the doubting voices and dismissive looks. In the air, she was exactly where she belonged, but even her impressive flight scores couldn't silence the whispers. During mess hall conversations, she overheard pilots placing bets on how long she would last before washing out of the program. Some predicted she would quit after her first high-G maneuver training session. Others thought she might make it through basic flight training, but would crack under pressure during combat simulation. The base commander, Colonel Robert Hayes, remained neutral but cautious about Sarah's presence. He had received pressure from Washington to explore all available pilot resources, but he also faced pushback from his veteran aviators who worried about unit cohesion. "She can stay for now," he had told Dr. Patterson during a private meeting. But at the first sign that she can't handle the physical demands, she's gone. Sarah knew she was walking a tightrope. One mistake, one moment of visible weakness, and her dream would be over. The weight of representing all women in aviation pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy flight suit. She couldn't just succeed. She had to be exceptional. She had to prove that women could not only fly military aircraft but excel at it. As she prepared for another day of training, Sarah caught her reflection in the polished surface of a propeller. The face looking back at her showed determination mixed with exhaustion. The past months had taken their toll, but they had also forged her into something stronger. Every dismissive comment, every skeptical glance, every suggestion that she should find a more suitable career had only hardened her resolve. The other trainees were beginning to arrive, their voices carrying across the tarmac as they discussed the day's exercises. Sarah knew that soon she would face another series of tests designed to push pilots to their limits. The G-force training would be particularly challenging, spinning pilots in a centrifuge until their vision grayed and their bodies screamed for relief. Dr. Patterson believed she would fail this test. Captain Wheeler expected her to wash out. Even some of the more supportive officers had expressed quiet doubts about her ability to withstand the physical punishment that combat flying demanded. But Sarah had a secret weapon that none of them knew about. Months of preparation, careful study, and relentless self-conditioning had prepared her for this moment. She was about to show them that their assumptions about women and G-forces were not just wrong. They were dangerously outdated, thinking that could cost lives in wartime. The sound of approaching aircraft engines interrupted her thoughts. In the distance, she could see the training planes being prepared for the day's missions. Soon, she would climb into one of those cockpits and demonstrate exactly what she was capable of achieving. The centrifuge facility stood like a mechanical monster in the corner of the medical building, its massive arm capable of spinning at deadly speeds. Sarah stared at the contraption that had ended the dreams of many aspiring pilots. The machine could simulate the crushing G-forces experienced during high-speed turns and dives, pushing the human body beyond its natural limits. Dr. Patterson stood beside the control panel, clipboard in hand, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who was about to prove his point. Several other medical staff members had gathered to witness what they expected would be Sarah's inevitable failure. Word had spread through the base that the woman pilot was finally going to face the test that would send her home. "Miss Martinez," Dr. Patterson announced formally, "you will be subjected to forces ranging from 4 to 8 Gs. Most trained male pilots begin experiencing vision problems at 6 Gs and lose consciousness around 7. Given your physical limitations, I expect we'll see significant impairment much earlier." Sarah nodded calmly, though her heart was racing. She had studied the physiological effects extensively. At 4 Gs, her body would weigh 4 times its normal amount, making it difficult to lift her arms. At 6 Gs, blood would begin pooling in her lower body, reducing flow to her brain and causing tunnel vision. At 8 Gs, most people would black out completely. Captain Wheeler had arrived to watch the spectacle, along with several other pilots, who had never taken her seriously. They clustered around the observation window, making quiet comments about how quickly she would tap out. One of them had even brought popcorn, as if this were entertainment rather than a crucial evaluation. As Sarah strapped herself into the centrifuge seat, she thought about the countless hours she had spent preparing for this moment. The makeshift training device in her father's barn had been crude but effective. She had gradually increased the spinning speed week after week, learning to control her breathing and muscle tension to maintain blood flow to her brain. The technician handed her the emergency stop button, a red device that would immediately halt the machine if she felt overwhelmed. "Don't be embarrassed to use this," he said kindly. "Everyone has their limits." The machine began with a low hum that gradually increased in pitch. Sarah felt the first gentle push as the centrifuge started spinning, pressing her back into the padded seat. At 2 Gs, the sensation was manageable, like lying on her back with someone sitting on her chest. The observers watched through the window, waiting for signs of distress. At 4 Gs, Sarah's vision began to change slightly, but she had expected this. She tensed her leg muscles and performed the breathing technique she had practiced hundreds of times, forcing blood back toward her brain. The other pilots pressed closer to the window, surprised that she was still conscious and alert. Dr. Patterson frowned at his instruments. According to his reading, Sarah's heart rate and blood pressure were elevated but stable. Most candidates at this point were showing signs of significant stress. He increased the speed, At 6 Gs, the crushing weight made every movement an enormous effort. Sarah felt the familiar gray edges creeping into her peripheral vision, but she fought against them with techniques she had developed during her secret training. She visualized blood flowing upward through her body, imagined her muscles as pumps pushing vital fluids toward her brain. The watching pilots had stopped making jokes. Captain Wheeler stepped closer to the window, studying Sarah's face for signs of impending collapse. Her jaw was clenched with concentration, but her eyes remained focused and aware. This wasn't what anyone had expected to see. "Remarkable," muttered one of the medical technicians. "Her vital signs are still within acceptable ranges." Dr. Patterson's confidence began to waver. He had been so certain that this test would vindicate his position about women in combat aviation. Instead, he was watching his theories crumble in real time. He called out through the intercom, "Miss Martinez, how are you feeling?" Sarah managed to respond clearly. "Continuing with the test, sir." Her voice was strained but steady. At 7 Gs, most male pilots would have lost consciousness by now. Sarah felt as if an elephant was sitting on her chest, and the gray tunnel vision was becoming more pronounced. But months of conditioning had prepared her for this exact situation. She had learned to recognize the warning signs and counter them before they became dangerous. The room had fallen completely silent except for the whirring of the centrifuge. Every observer was transfixed by what they were witnessing. This woman was not only surviving forces that typically knocked out experienced male aviators, but she was doing it with a composure that bordered on the supernatural. 8 Gs. The maximum, force that the military considered survivable during combat maneuvers. Sarah's world had narrowed to a small circle of gray light, but she remained conscious and in control. Her breathing was labored but rhythmic, her muscle tension perfectly calibrated to maintain blood flow despite the crushing acceleration. Dr. Patterson stared at his instruments in disbelief. The readings showed stress, certainly, but nothing approaching the physiological collapse he had predicted. Sarah Martinez was not just surviving 8 Gs, she was mastering them. The test concluded, and the centrifuge gradually slowed to a stop. As the crushing weight lifted from her body, Sarah took several deep breaths and unbuckled her safety harness. She stood up slowly, testing her balance, and walked steadily toward the exit. The room erupted in stunned conversation. Several pilots, who had dismissed her as a publicity stunt, now looked at her with something approaching respect. Captain Wheeler scratched his head, clearly reevaluating his assumptions about women in combat aviation. Dr. Patterson approached Sarah as she collected her belongings. His earlier smugness had been replaced by scientific curiosity. "Miss Martinez, that was unexpected. Your performance exceeded that of many of our most experienced pilots. How did you prepare for this?" Sarah smiled for the first time all day. "The same way I prepare for everything, Doctor. With dedication, study, and refusal to accept that something is impossible just because it hasn't been done before." As news of her performance spread through the base, Sarah knew that she had crossed an important threshold. The test that was supposed to end her aviation dreams had instead opened new doors. But she also understood that this was just the beginning. Surviving the centrifuge was one thing. Proving herself in actual combat conditions would be an entirely different challenge. Little did anyone know that this challenge would come sooner than expected, and when it did, Sarah would be the only pilot ready to respond. The emergency siren pierced the morning calm at 6:47 a.m. on February 25, 1942. Sarah bolted upright in her barracks bunk as the haunting wail echoed across the Los Angeles Air Base. Around her, other pilots stumbled from their beds, confusion etched on their faces. This wasn't a drill. The sound was different, more urgent, more terrifying. Colonel Hayes burst through the barracks door, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "All pilots to the briefing room immediately. This is not a drill. Move, move, move." His voice carried an edge that made everyone's blood run cold. Sarah threw on her flight suit and boots, her mind racing through possibilities. Pearl Harbor had happened just months earlier, stunning America into the reality of war. Since then, the West Coast had been on high alert for possible Japanese attacks, but most people believed the enemy was too far away to pose a real threat to the mainland. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as pilots filed in, their faces reflecting the same mixture of excitement and fear that Sarah felt in her chest. Captain Wheeler sat in the front row, his usual swagger replaced by grim attention. Dr. Patterson stood near the back, no longer the skeptical observer but a medical officer preparing for potential casualties. Colonel Hayes strode to the front of the room and pointed at a large map of the Los Angeles coastline. Red markers dotted the ocean area west of the city, each one representing a potential threat. "Gentlemen," he began, then caught himself and nodded toward Sarah. "And lady, we have a situation. Radar stations have detected multiple unidentified aircraft approaching Los Angeles from the Pacific. Current count is 12 bombers flying in formation, estimated arrival in 45 minutes. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. 12 enemy bombers over Los Angeles would be catastrophic. The city's population of over 1.5 million people was completely unprepared for aerial attack. Anti-aircraft batteries were limited, and civilian air raid procedures were still being developed. Intelligence suggests these could be Japanese long-range bombers possibly launched from submarines or carriers positioned off our coast." Colonel Hayes continued. "Our job is to intercept and neutralize this threat before it reaches populated areas. Every available aircraft will be scrambled immediately." Sarah's pulse quickened. This was what she had trained for, what she had endured months of doubt and skepticism to achieve. Real combat, real danger, real opportunity to prove that women belonged in the cockpit when America needed every capable pilot in the air. But as Colonel Hayes began assigning aircraft and targets, Sarah noticed a troubling pattern. Pilot after pilot received their orders, but her name wasn't called. Captain Wheeler got the lead fighter position. Lieutenant Morrison was assigned to the bombing run coordinator role. Even pilots with less training and lower test scores than Sarah received combat assignments. Finally, as the briefing concluded and pilots began rushing toward their aircraft, Sarah approached Colonel Hayes. "Sir, what are my orders?" The colonel looked uncomfortable, glancing around to see who might be listening. "Miss Martinez, I need you to remain on standby, monitor radio communications, and be prepared to assist with coordination from the ground." "Ground support?" Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. "Sir, I've logged more flight hours than half the pilots you just sent up there. My G-force test scores were higher than anyone's. Why am I being kept on the ground when every pilot is needed?" "Colonel," Hayes lowered his voice. "Listen, Sarah, you've proven yourself capable under controlled conditions, but this is real combat. Lives are on the line. If something goes wrong up there, if you freeze or make a mistake, it could cost American lives and give aid to the enemy." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After everything she had accomplished, after proving herself again and again, she was still seen as a risk rather than an asset. While enemy bombers approached American soil, institutional prejudice was keeping one of the base's most capable pilots grounded. As the other pilots ran toward their aircraft, Sarah stood frozen in the briefing room. Through the windows, she could see mechanics frantically preparing fighters and bombers for takeoff. The roar of engines filled the air as one after another, the military aircraft taxied toward the runway. Dr. Patterson appeared beside her, his expression surprisingly sympathetic. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but the colonel is trying to protect you. Combat flying is different from anything you've experienced in training." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes blazing with frustration. "Doctor, with respect, 3 months ago you didn't think I could handle G-forces. You were wrong then. What makes you think the colonel isn't wrong now?" Before Dr. Patterson could respond, a new sound cut through the engine noise, the distant drone of aircraft approaching. From the west, the enemy bombers were ahead of schedule, and Sarah could see panic spreading across the airfield as ground crews realized how little time remained before the attack. Captain Wheeler's voice crackled over the radio system. "Tower, this is flight. Leader 1. We're experiencing mechanical problems with 2 of our fighters. Engine failure on approach. Requesting immediate backup aircraft." Sarah's heart sank. 2 of their interceptors were down before the mission even began. That left only 6 American aircraft to face 12 enemy bombers, odds that could spell disaster for Los Angeles. The tower radio operator's voice was tense. Flight Leader 1, negative on backup aircraft. All remaining planes are committed to the mission or undergoing maintenance. You'll have to proceed with reduced numbers. Sarah looked around the now empty briefing room, then out at the airfield where several aircraft sat ready but unmanned. The irony was bitter. America's most capable pilots were flying toward danger while she, one of the best-trained aviators on the base, remained grounded because of doubts that had nothing to do with her abilities. The sound of approaching enemy aircraft grew louder. In minutes, those bombers would be over Los Angeles, ready to rain destruction on American civilians. Meanwhile, bureaucratic caution was preventing one of the base's top pilots from joining the defense of her own country. Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life and possibly alter the outcome of the battle approaching the California coast. Sarah stood at the window of the briefing room, watching the last authorized fighter disappear into the western sky. The sound of enemy bombers grew steadily louder, a low, threatening drone that sent chills down her spine. In less than 20 minutes, those aircraft would be over Los Angeles, and 6 American fighters against 12 enemy bombers were not good odds. The radio chatter from the intercepting squadron painted an increasingly grim picture. Captain Wheeler's voice was tight with concern. Tower, enemy formation is larger than expected. We're counting at least 14 aircraft now, possibly more. We need immediate reinforcements. Negative. Flight Leader 1, came the response from the control tower. No additional aircraft available. You'll have to engage with current numbers and hope the anti-aircraft batteries can provide support. Sarah knew those anti-aircraft guns. She had studied their positions and capabilities extensively. They were outdated, undermanned, and positioned primarily around the harbor and key military installations. Large sections of Los Angeles would be completely unprotected if the enemy bombers broke through the fighter screen. Dr. Patterson had left to prepare the medical facilities for potential casualties. Colonel Hayes was coordinating with city officials and military command. Most of the ground crew was focused on monitoring radio communications and tracking the approaching battle. The airfield had an almost surreal quiet, punctuated only by the distant sound of aircraft engines and the occasional burst of radio static. Walking toward the hangar, Sarah found herself drawn to a P-40 Warhawk that sat fueled and ready for flight. The aircraft had been prepped for training exercises that were now canceled due to the emergency. Its .50 caliber machine guns were loaded, its fuel tanks topped off, its engine recently serviced and running perfectly. Sergeant Mike Kowalski, the chief mechanic, emerged from beneath the aircraft's wing. He had worked with Sarah during her training and was one of the few people on base who had always treated her with professional respect rather than condescending tolerance. "Shame they've got you benched for this one, Martinez," he said quietly, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rag. "If I was picking pilots for this mission, you'd be flying lead." Sarah studied the P-40's sleek lines and felt the familiar pull she experienced around aircraft. "Sergeant, hypothetically speaking, how long would it take to get this bird airborne?" Kowalski followed her gaze and understood immediately. "Hypothetically, she's ready to fly right now. Full fuel, full ammo, engine warm. A good pilot could be wheels up in under 3 minutes." He paused, then added more quietly, "Of course, that would require someone willing to take responsibility for launching without official orders." The radio crackled with urgent updates. "Tower, this is Flight Leader 1. We're engaging the enemy now. They've got fighter escorts we didn't expect. Repeat, enemy bombers have fighter protection. We are outnumbered at least 2 to 1. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to calculate the odds. Even if the American fighters performed perfectly, some enemy bombers would inevitably break through. Los Angeles was about to experience its first aerial attack since the war began, and thousands of civilians could die while she stood on the ground following orders that made no tactical sense. The sound of machine gun fire drifted across the distance, indicating that the aerial battle had begun. Sarah knew that every moment of delay reduced the chances of intercepting bombers before they reached populated areas. "Sergeant," she said finally, "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Setting aside military, protocol and chain of command, do you believe I'm qualified to fly combat missions?" Kowalski didn't hesitate. "Martinez, you're one of the 3 best pilots I've ever worked with, and I've been maintaining military aircraft for 15 years. Your stick and rudder skills are superior to most of the guys who just took off. Your knowledge of aircraft systems is encyclopedic. And after watching you handle that G-force testing, I know you've got the physical capability for combat flying." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward this gruff mechanic who had always judged her by her abilities rather than her gender. His honest assessment confirmed what she already knew in her heart. She was ready for this mission regardless of what the command structure believed. Another radio transmission brought more bad news. "Tower, we've lost Johnson. His aircraft is going down. Enemy fighters are breaking through our perimeter. At least 3 bombers are proceeding toward the city." That decided it. Sarah couldn't stand by and watch American civilians get bombed while she remained grounded due to institutional prejudice. Her country needed every capable pilot in the air, and she was demonstrably more capable than some of the men currently engaged in combat. "Sergeant Kowalski," she said formally, "I'm going to ask you to do something that could get us both court-martialed. I need you to help me get this aircraft airborne." The mechanic looked at her for a long moment, then at the P-40, then back at her face. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to prep this plane for immediate takeoff and then disappear for about 10 minutes. Don't see me climb into the cockpit. Don't see me start the engine. Don't see me taxi to the runway. When they ask you later, you were in the bathroom and have no idea how that aircraft got airborne." Kowalski grinned despite the seriousness of the situation. "You know what, Martinez? I suddenly feel a powerful need to use the facilities. Might take me a while too. Something I ate this morning isn't agreeing with me." As the mechanic walked away, Sarah approached the P-40 with a mixture of determination and terror. She was about to disobey direct orders, potentially ending her military career and facing serious criminal charges. But she was also about to do what she had trained her entire life to accomplish: defend her country when it needed her most. The radio brought one final urgent message that sealed her decision. "Tower, this is Flight Leader 1. We're down. To 4 fighters operational. Multiple enemy bombers have broken through. They're heading directly for downtown Los Angeles. We cannot stop them all." Sarah climbed into the P-40's cockpit and began the engine startup sequence. The P-40's engine roared to life with a sound that filled Sarah's entire being. Every gauge showed green. Every system responded perfectly to her touch. As she taxied toward the runway, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration that she had never experienced during training flights. The control tower's voice crackled through her headset. "Unknown aircraft on runway 2. Identify yourself immediately. You do not have clearance for takeoff." Sarah reached for her radio switch, then hesitated. Once she responded, there would be no turning back. She would be officially disobeying orders, potentially facing court-martial and imprisonment. But through her canopy, she could see smoke rising from the direction of Los Angeles, indicating that enemy bombers had already begun their attack. "Tower, this is Lieutenant Sarah Martinez in P-40 number 447. I am proceeding to engage enemy aircraft, threatening Los Angeles." The radio erupted with shocked voices. "Martinez, you are ordered to return to the hangar immediately. You do not have authorization for this mission." "Tower, respectfully, Los Angeles is under attack and American lives are in danger. I am a qualified combat pilot and I'm going to do my job." Sarah pushed the throttle forward and felt the P-40 surge down the runway. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, and within seconds she was climbing rapidly toward the battle raging in the western sky. Behind her, she could hear increasingly frantic radio calls ordering her to return, but she had committed herself to this path. Flying toward the sound of combat, Sarah spotted the aerial battle about 15 miles west of the city. Captain Wheeler's remaining fighters were engaged in desperate dogfights with Japanese Zero fighters, while several enemy bombers continued eastward toward their targets. Smoke trails marked the positions of downed aircraft, and Sarah could see at least 2 parachutes drifting toward the ocean. As she approached the combat zone, Sarah's training took over completely. All the months of preparation, all the hours of studying aerial combat tactics, all the physical conditioning she had endured, everything coalesced into sharp focus. She was no longer the woman pilot fighting for acceptance. She was a warrior, defending her homeland. Her first target was a Japanese bomber that had broken away from the main formation and was heading directly toward downtown Los Angeles. The twin-engine aircraft was flying low and fast, probably carrying enough explosives to level several city blocks. Sarah positioned her P-40 for an attack run, lining up behind and slightly below the bomber to avoid its defensive guns. The sensation of pulling the trigger in actual combat was unlike anything from training. Her .50 caliber machine guns erupted in a deadly stream of tracers that walked across the bomber's fuselage. She could see pieces of metal flying off the enemy aircraft as her bullets found their mark. The bomber's left engine began trailing smoke and then burst into flames. But the Japanese crew wasn't finished. The bomber's rear gunner opened fire on Sarah's approaching fighter, and she heard the terrifying sound of enemy bullets striking her aircraft. Her left wing shuddered as several rounds punched through the aluminum skin, but the P-40 continued flying normally. Sarah pressed her attack, closing to nearly point-blank range before firing another long burst into the bomber's cockpit area. This time the effect was decisive. The enemy aircraft shuddered, rolled over, and began spiraling toward the ground. She watched it crash into an empty field several miles short of the city, eliminating one threat to civilian lives. Unknown. P-40, this is Flight Leader 1, came Captain Wheeler's voice over the radio. Is that you, Martinez? Affirmative, Flight Leader. Engaging enemy bombers per my training and duty. There was a pause before Wheeler responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of grudging respect. Roger that. We've got 3 more bombers heading for the harbor. Can you intercept? Sarah was already turning toward the new targets. On my way, Flight Leader. The next engagement was more challenging. 3 Japanese bombers flying in tight formation, with 0 fighters providing cover above them. Sarah realized that attacking the bombers directly would be suicide. She would have to deal with the fighters first. Using tactics she had studied but never practiced in real combat, Sarah climbed above the enemy formation and dove at high speed toward one of the Zeros. The Japanese pilot saw her coming and turned to engage, but Sarah's superior diving speed gave her a crucial advantage. She fired a quick burst that damaged the Zero's engine, forcing it to break off its protective roll. The aerial dance that followed was a test of everything Sarah had learned about high-G maneuvering. The remaining Zero pilot was skilled and aggressive, putting both aircraft through punishing turns and climbs that pushed the limits of human endurance. Sarah felt the familiar gray edges of tunnel vision as G-forces crushed her body, but her months of conditioning allowed her to maintain consciousness and control. During one particularly violent maneuver, Sarah managed to get behind the Zero and line up a killing shot. Her machine guns hammered the enemy fighter until it exploded in a ball of orange flame. She had no time to celebrate, however, because the 3 bombers were now approaching the Long Beach harbor area, where dozens of American ships were anchored. Flying at maximum speed, Sarah overtook the bomber formation and positioned herself for a head-on attack. This was the most dangerous type of engagement, both aircraft flying directly at each other at combined speeds of over 400 miles per hour. The slightest miscalculation would mean a fatal collision. Sarah opened fire at maximum range, her tracers reaching out toward the lead bomber. The enemy pilot held his course, probably hoping to complete his bombing run before dealing with her attack. At the last possible second, both aircraft turned to avoid collision, but Sarah's gunfire had found its mark. The bomber's fuel tanks exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the morning sky. The remaining 2 bombers, now without fighter protection and facing determined opposition, jettisoned their bombs harmlessly into the ocean and turned back toward the west. Sarah pursued them briefly, but her fuel was running low and she had accomplished her primary objective, protecting Los Angeles from aerial attack. As she turned back toward base, Sarah realized that she had not only survived her first combat mission, but had achieved something unprecedented. She had shot down multiple enemy aircraft and prevented a devastating attack on American civilians. But now she had to face the consequences of her decision to disobey orders. Sarah's damaged P-40 touched down on the runway with smoke still streaming from bullet holes in her left wing. As she taxied toward the hangar, she could see a crowd of personnel waiting for her, some cheering, others looking stern and official. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the group, his expression unreadable. Climbing out of the cockpit, Sarah felt the adrenaline of combat finally beginning to fade, replaced by the reality of what she had done. She had disobeyed direct orders, taken an aircraft without authorization, and engaged in combat without official permission. By military law, these actions could result in court-martial and imprisonment. Captain Wheeler approached her first, his face showing a mixture of admiration and concern. "Martinez, that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. You saved hundreds, maybe thousands of civilian lives today." He lowered his voice. "But you're in serious trouble with command." Dr. Patterson pushed through the crowd, medical bag in hand, ready to examine Sarah for combat injuries. His earlier skepticism about women in aviation seemed to have evaporated completely. "Miss Martinez, how are you feeling? Any injuries?" "That was extraordinary flying out there." Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his face grave. "Lieutenant Martinez, you are under arrest for disobedience of direct orders, unauthorized use of military equipment, and engaging in combat without proper authorization. You will be confined to quarters pending a full military investigation." The crowd fell silent. Sarah had expected this moment, but hearing the words still sent a chill through her body. She stood at attention and replied formally, "Yes, sir. I understand the charges." But before the military police could escort her away, Sergeant Kowalski stepped forward with a radio in his hand. "Colonel, sir, you need to hear this transmission from Los Angeles city officials." The radio crackled with the voice of the Los Angeles mayor. "To the commanding officer of the airbase, we have received reports that one of your pilots single-handedly prevented what could have been the worst civilian disaster in California history. The pilot, identified as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, shot down multiple enemy aircraft and saved countless American lives. The city of Los Angeles requests the opportunity to honor this hero." Colonel Hayes looked confused. How did civilian authorities learn about classified military operations? Captain Wheeler cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, it seems several thousand civilians witnessed the air battle from the ground. News reporters are already calling it the Battle of Los Angeles, and Lieutenant Martinez is being hailed as a national hero. The story is spreading across the country." Within hours, the situation had spiraled far beyond the control of military bureaucracy. Newspaper headlines across America screamed about the woman pilot who had defied orders to defend Los Angeles. Radio broadcasts carried interviews with civilians who had witnessed Sarah shooting down enemy bombers. Movie newsreels featured dramatic footage of the aerial battle, with Sarah's P-40 clearly visible engaging multiple enemy aircraft. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Letters and telegrams poured into the air base from across the country, praising Sarah's courage and demanding that she be decorated rather than court-martialed. Women's organizations held rallies supporting her actions. Even some members of Congress began questioning why such a capable pilot had been grounded during a national emergency. 3 days later, Sarah was summoned to Colonel Hayes's office for what she assumed would be the formal reading of court-martial charges. Instead, she found the colonel sitting behind his desk with a stack of newspapers and a telegram from Washington, D.C. "Sit down, Lieutenant Martinez," he said wearily. "We have a situation that's gotten completely out of hand." Sarah remained standing. "Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions. I was trained to defend American lives, and that's what I did." Colonel Hayes held up the telegram. "This is from the Secretary of War himself. Due to public pressure and the undeniable success of your unauthorized mission, all charges against you are being dropped. Furthermore, you're being promoted to captain and assigned to lead a new experimental squadron of women combat pilots." Sarah felt her knees go weak. "Sir, I don't understand. The publicity from your actions has forced Washington to reconsider their position on women in combat aviation. Your performance proved that women can not only fly combat missions, but excel at them under the most difficult circumstances. The military can no longer justify excluding qualified women pilots when the country needs every capable aviator. Dr. Patterson, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. Captain Martinez, I owe you an apology. My assumptions about women in G-forces were not just wrong, they were dangerous. Your superior conditioning and preparation made you more capable than many male pilots, not less. Over the following months, Sarah found herself at the center of a revolution in military aviation. The Women's Combat Aviation Squadron, which she commanded, became one of the most effective units in the Pacific Theater. Female pilots who had been rejected by traditional programs flocked to serve under her leadership. The same critics who had once doubted women's physical capabilities were forced to confront statistical evidence that female pilots actually had several advantages in combat situations. Their smaller size made them harder targets. Their typically superior hand-eye coordination improved gunnery accuracy, and their methodical approach to training resulted in fewer accidents and higher mission success rates. Sarah's story became a symbol of American determination and equality. She appeared on recruiting posters encouraging women to join the war effort. Hollywood made a movie about the Battle of Los Angeles, starring a famous actress as Sarah. Most importantly, her actions opened doors for thousands of women who had dreamed of serving their country as combat pilots. Years later, when military historians analyzed the Pacific War, they consistently noted that the inclusion of women pilots had been a crucial factor in American victory. The additional pilots provided by opening aviation to women had helped offset critical pilot shortages during key battles. Sarah herself continued flying combat missions throughout the war, eventually becoming one of the highest-scoring American pilots in the Pacific Theater. But she always said that her most important victory wasn't any individual enemy aircraft she had shot down. It was the day she proved that courage, skill, and determination were not limited by gender. The woman they had doubted could withstand. G-forces had not only survived the ultimate test but had changed the course of American military aviation forever. Her willingness to risk everything for what she knew was right had opened the skies to generations of women who followed in her contrails. In the end, Sarah Martinez had done more than defend Los Angeles from enemy bombers. She had defended the principle that in America, anyone with the ability and determination to serve their country should have that opportunity, regardless of the prejudices of those who doubted them.